Weapons in Siege come in many different varieties. In the game, there are currently 107 weapons spanning across all weapon classes that fill their own role in the sandbox. However, because of the sheer amount of choices available, making a decision can be difficult. So, in today's video, I'm going to be ranking every SMG from worst to best once again. Strap in because things are going to get interesting. Before I can go into the placements, I must first explain my testing methodology, because this will drastically affect my rankings when testing a gun's recoil. When testing a gun's recoil, I will exclusively use a suppressor and vertical grip to provide a more accurate representation of the gun's recoil. I want the recoil in the video to be the worst possible scenario so that we can better judge the weapon's actual recoil. Attachments available will bear no effect on my ranking. I will rank guns based on their effectiveness without the extended barrel, and magnification sights will not play a role. This will cause confusion on weapons that have different attachments on different operators, and it would have caused bad guns to get carried by their attachment selection, which Ubisoft swaps around every update anyways. Testing will just come down to recoil, animation times if they are bad or good enough to be worth noting, and stats like fire rate, damage per shot, and damage per second, which I calculated myself. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the rankings. Starting out with the worst SMG in Siege, we have the MPX. This may surprise some of you, but spare your comments because I think this gun genuinely deserves it. The MPX only deals 26 damage, it has a fire rate of 830, and its overall DPS is way below average, being only 359. It doesn't even have a fast reload speed. The only redeeming quality of the MPX is the low recoil, which is the reason a lot of people defend it, because at the end of the day, in Siege, a headshot is all that's necessary. But when we are ranking all of the weapons and comparing them, a weapon with this atrocious of stats has to go on the bottom. The M12 finds itself in a very similar position, as many of you know, which is why it's here in the 19th spot. The M12 is an operator exclusive weapon, being only available on Caveira, and I think that's by design because this weapon is really bad. Its damage may be a high 40, but its fire rate is extremely slow, being only 550. For an SMG, this is garbage, and it makes the M12 have one of the worst DPSs in this video. Like the MPX though, the M12 has super low recoil and an average reload speed of 3 seconds, but realistically, when your damage is this bad, the recoil and reload speed doesn't really matter. As for the 18th spot, we have the 9mm C1, one of the most overrated SMGs in the game in my opinion. That's because this gun's damage is only 36 and its fire rate is only 575, making it the second worst fire rate SMG in the game. This means that the C1 is also the worst DPS gun in the game as well, which may come as a surprise to some of you. And like every other gun discussed so far, it may have low recoil, but this still doesn't help it much. The only reason the C1 is not in last place is because of its slightly higher magazine size and its reload speed being the fastest of any SMG at 2.7 seconds. If those things weren't in its favor, then it would be a very different story. Now in the 17th spot, we have a weapon that many people like simply for its weapon sights. That weapon being the MP5. The MP5 has a decent amount of horizontal recoil, not enough to be a deal breaker, but it's still worth taking note of, and its stats aren't great either. At the time of recording, the MP5 has a fire rate of 800, a terrible damage of 27, and a below average DPS of 360. The only good thing about the MP5 is its relatively decent reload speed of 2.9 seconds. Moving on to the 16th spot, we have the P10 Roni. This gun has had a fall off of the century, and that's for one main reason: magazine size. At the time of recording, the P10 Roni only has a magazine capacity of 15, which is awful and the worst in this video. However, even with that fact out of the equation, the P10 Roni is still pretty mid. Its recoil is easy, especially compared to most, but the mediocre part is in its stats. The P10 Roni has a damage of 26, which is low, but a fire rate of 980, making its DPS an average 424. But no matter how good the gun is, 15 bullets is not going to be enough to win gunfights against multiple people. Moving on to the 15th spot, we have the UMP45. The UMP has a very similar problem to the previously mentioned M12, and that is its DPS. It only has a fire rate of 600, and its damage is only 36, making its overall DPS a measly 380. On top of its super low DPS, it also has a low magazine capacity of 25. It does have quite low recoil and a reload speed of 2.9 seconds though, to make it a little more viable and to justify it going slightly higher on this list. Next up in the 14th spot, we have the P90. This gun is criminally underrated in my opinion, because many players consider the P90 to be one of the worst guns in the game, and I just disagree with that. I think Solace's reign kind of proves that point, since most people really enjoyed using her P90 while she was viable. I think the reason for this is pretty clear in the specs of the weapon. The P90 is the only SMG on defense that has a 50 round magazine. This combined with the low recoil and the fast fire rate of 970 makes it really satisfying to use. However, the reason why I don't have the gun super high up is because of the damage output. It deals a measly 22 damage, which makes its DPS 356, which is definitely below average. For me, the fire rate and recoil does help it out a lot though, and that's why this gun isn't further down. After After the P90, we have the MP5K in the 13th spot. The MP5K is a weapon that sadly doesn't get much love because of it mainly being on mute MMI, who don't have really strong weapons to compete with it. However, I think it is decent. It has a higher damage of 30 and a fire rate of 800, making its DPS an average 400. Its recoil is also much less than its MP5 predecessor, which is surprising considering the better stats. And it even has a faster reload speed of 2.8 seconds. Overall, I think considering that it has an average DPS of 400, I can't really justify putting it higher, but it is still a solid option in my opinion nonetheless. Now, next up in the 12th spot, we have the MP5 SD. This is basically just an MP5K, but better. It has the exact same stats as the MP5K, except it has a lot less recoil, a built-in suppressor, and a slightly faster reload speed of 2.7 seconds. Out of all the weapons in this video, this is probably in my top 5 when it comes to using it in-game. But its stats really cannot justify that ranking, especially since it's just a carbon copy of the MP5K. The AUG A3 finds itself in the number 11 spot, and it is where I think the good submachine guns will really start popping up. First off, it has great stats with a damage of 36, a fire rate of 700, and a DPS of 420. This thing also has extremely low recoil, such low recoil that it's honestly a contender for the lowest in the video. I think this is by far the most slept on weapon on the defensive side. The AUG may not stack up well against attacker weapons, and his reload speed may be slow comparatively to the rest of the class, but it is still a solid option on defense, especially if you want a harder hitting SMG. After the AUG, we have a pretty popular SMG in the form of the MX4 Storm. This is loved for pretty good reasons. Firstly, this weapon's stats are insane. It has a fire rate of 950 and a damage of 26, meaning its DPS is a solid 411. But it also has low recoil, an average magazine size, and a decent reload speed. Overall, the MX4 Storm is just a solid SMG and definitely worthy of the 10th spot. Now, next up in the number 9 spot, we have the Scorpion Evo. This weapon has had insane ups and downs throughout Siege's history, going from objectively the best gun in the game to one of the weakest to where it is now. The weapon in its states today is going to be a mixed bag. Some people love it, others hate it. For me, I lean more on the loving side. The 40 round magazine with its high fire rate of 1080 makes for the perfect combination for a satisfying weapon. However, there are some drawbacks. Firstly, the weapon has relatively hard to control recoil, and its damage is only 23, making its DPS a 414. Still above average, but not amazing. Overall, I think the fire rate and magazine size are enough to push it up to this point for me though. After the Scorpion Evo, we have another SMG that is quite popular, that being the K1A. This weapon is basically the opposite of many of the SMGs we have discussed thus far. That's because it's a high damage and low fire rate weapon, with a 36 damage and 720 fire rate. This makes its DPS an impressive 432. The only thing stopping this gun from going higher is its slightly higher recoil, which results in it being placed where it is now. Next up in the 7th spot, we have the UZK. This weapon was quite popular in Thorn's heyday, but that isn't the case anymore, despite it being quite solid. Its recoil is low and its DPS output is high, being 420, due to it having a damage of 36 and a fire rate of 700. The gun does have a low magazine size of 22, but since its fire rate is low, this has less of an effect than on guns like the P10 Roni, which is why I placed the gun in the position I found. There are definitely SMGs in the game that are better than it, but overall it's still solid. Moving to the 6th spot, the T5 SMG finds itself here. On the stat sheet, the T5 looks quite impressive. It has a decent damage of 28 with a high fire rate of 900 and a DPS of 420. This puts the T5 in a really good position compared to the competition. However, the recoil can get to be pretty jumpy, which can make it inconsistent in inexperienced hands. If this gun's recoil was slightly easier, it may have climbed a little higher on the list, but I still think it's in a good spot. I just can't justify putting it any higher with the way it is right now. After the T5, we have a very similar gun being the VSN. This gun's DPS is just 5 points higher than the T5, being 425, as a result of its 34 damage and 750 fire rate. The recoil is also kind of similar, being relatively jumpy. This obviously means I had to place it right above the T5 in the 5th spot. Next up, we have the FMG9 in the 4th spot. This weapon is insanely underrated. It just doesn't get picked much due to the operators it is on, but when put up against the competition in its class, it really does stand out. The reason I believe this is because the gun has great stats on paper. The FMG9 has a damage of 34, a fire rate of 800, and a DPS of 453. This makes it have a DPS in the top 5 of SMGs, but there are some guns above with better stats that stop it from climbing past this point. And its recoil is relatively moderate as well. There are just some guns above with better stats that stop it from climbing past this point. After the FMG9, we can now discuss the weapon in 3rd place, the Vector. Now, if I put this gun in 1st place, most of you probably wouldn't have even batted an eye, and that goes for most weapons in this area of this list. But what stopped me from putting it there is the vertical recoil present along with the low mag size. But its stats are so crazy that these downsides downsides typically don't matter for the average person. The Vector has a damage of 23 and an insanely fast fire rate of 1200, making its DPS 460. This thing absolutely shreds, but at the top of the list to help narrow things down, I have to get really nitpicky, and I just decided to put the Vector in the third spot considering the downsides I discussed. Moving on to the second spot, we have the attacking side exclusive PDW. This gun isn't on defense, likely due to its sheer strength. The moderate recoil, high magazine size of 50 bullets per mag, with great stats makes it dominate. It has a decent damage of 34, it has a fire rate of 800, and a DPS of 453. The main reason it finds its way this high though is the 50 round magazine, because it helps it stand out amongst the crowd, especially with stats like this to back it up. Now for the final and best SMG in the video, we have the MP7, same as last time. None of you will be surprised by this either. This is what every SMG wants to be. It has low recoil, access to solid stats, and a fast reload speed to go along with. The stats in question are the damage of 32, the fast fire rate of 900, and the DPS of 480. As you can see, this gun really doesn't have any issues worth noting, and that's why I decided that for the second time in a row, this weapon deserves to be crowned the best SMG in Rainbow Six Siege. Anyways, that wraps up today's video. As always, these videos are strictly my opinion, and if you disagree, feel free to leave your takes in the comments down below. If you enjoyed today's video, I make Siege content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. If you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure y'all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.